Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Care, Power, and Advocacy, Community Lawyering and Movement Partnership and Practice. Today's session is going to be about community-centered models of legal advocacy and movement partnership. And we're hoping that after this session, it will help to strengthen your knowledge of client-centered advocacy, coalition building, disability and racial justice, and strategic legal problem solving through looking at real world examples of community-centered policy advocacy and litigation. And before we dive in, I want to just introduce our presenters. It will be myself, Rashida Phillips. We also have Antoinette Dozier and Etisha Burrell. And before we jump in, just to share a little bit about Western Center. We are a statewide legal advocacy organization. We focus on housing, healthcare, public benefits, and economic justice. And one thing that makes our work different is that we generally don't provide direct legal services to individual clients, but instead we focus on impact litigation, legislative advocacy, administrative advocacy, technical assistance, and coalition support. And much of our work is supporting organizations and communities that are already working to lead change in their communities. I also want to share some housekeeping tips before we jump into the presentation. So just so folks know, you can turn on closed captions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a section where you can hit the CC button. And then also there is a Q&A box. So if you have questions, you can submit them via the Q&A panel, and we'll try to get through them. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible throughout the presentation. You can also use the chat feature for comments, technical issues, to share resources with other participants. So that chat section is open, and would love if folks want to share your name, where you're coming from, in the chat with us right now, what organization you're with and where you're at. So use that chat feature to do that. And then accessibility, if you have any accessibility needs or encounter any tech barriers, please let us know through the chat. You can either direct chat me or Antoinette or Etisha, or let us know in the regular chat. And then also just to let everybody know, this session is being recorded and we will share materials after the event. So we'll make sure to email folks right after with the recording and everything. Before we get started, I do have a poll for everybody. Would love to hear from folks on who is joining us today. So if you can just answer this, and whether you're a summer intern, a 1 to 3 year attorney, a 3+ year attorney, 6+ year attorney, paralegal or advocate, or someone else who is with us today. I'll give you about 10 more seconds to take that. Yes, and continue to introduce yourself in the chat if you are so inclined. All right, and I'm going to end that poll, which most of you took. Thank you so much. And just to share the results so we all know who is with us. So we have quite a few summer interns, which is awesome to see. Good concentration of 1 to 3 year newer attorneys. A couple of 3-year plus attorneys. And then we have a good concentration of 6-year plus attorneys. And then we have a few paralegals and other types of legal advocates. And then we have people who are something else, fit into a different category. So thank you so much for joining us today. And then I have one more poll, one more housekeeping thing, which is a attendance poll so that you can get your credits for being here. So as you may know, we offer MCLE credits for these summer training series. And so, and to ensure that you have that, please fill out this poll, and we will also drop a link into the chat for another attendance form that you can take out to fill out to make sure that you get your credit. So I'll give you about 20 seconds to take that. And thank you so much. And again, in the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourself, where you're calling from today before the long weekend, what organization you're with. Would love to hear from you. All right. So I'm going to end that poll, and then we are going to now jump into our presentation. Okay. All right, so by the end of this training, these are the goals of the training. We're hoping that you're able to describe what community lawyering is, how it centers the expertise and leadership of directly impacted communities, explore why litigation is just one advocacy tool of many, and how legal advocacy can support organizing, administrative advocacy, and other forms of policy change. And then to be able to identify some strategies for partnering with community movements to build power and to achieve sustainable community-driven solutions. And so I'm going to start us off with just like, here's what a definition of community lawyering and community advocacy looks like. Here's some examples, and then I'm going to pass it on to my co-presenters to give us some additional examples and frameworks for how we approach community-centered advocacy. So what is community lawyering? It's a term that is frequently, invoked, and it could mean different things to different people, right? There's no one specific approach or way to practice community lawyering. But if we had to define it, it's an approach to advocacy that recognizes impacted communities as partners with expertise, leadership, and agency, not just people who are just receiving legal services, right? So it seeks to align legal advocacy with community priorities where appropriate to build community power, which is a very key piece of the community lawyering definition, and to support durable systems change through relationships, collaboration, and shared strategy, right? So it's an approach that can complement a number of different approaches, right? And I encourage people to think about like when you hear the phrase community lawyering, like really what comes to mind for you? Is there like a specific way that you think about it? Is it, do you think about it as just representing lots of clients, or if you have community in the name of your organization, right, that it means that you're doing community lawyering? Um, and I'm here to say, right, like not necessarily, right? It's something that can complement litigation. It's something that can complement different types of advocacy, and it does not require any specific or single approach or model or set of activities, right? But there are key things that are important about community lawyering and a community lawyering approach, which is again building power with communities, making sure that we are focused on their issues and that they are bringing the issues, and helping to set the strategy versus the more traditional models where the lawyer is in the driver's seat in terms of setting the strategy and analyzing the issue, et cetera. And so again, just to emphasize, community lawyering is a shared language. It's not necessarily a single model. It's not limited to direct representation. It's not necessarily limited to neighborhood-based work. And it's also not a replacement for litigation, legislative advocacy, or policy expertise. It really is, you can look at it as a set of tools, a set of values, practices, and strategic orientations that can strengthen all of these approaches. And so they work alongside of all of these approaches, not to the exclusion of one or the other. Right. And we recognize that, for those of us who practice community lawyering, that not everything requires it, right? So again, it's not a approach that's at the exclusion of other tactics or techniques or strategies or ways to approach. I actually like to think of it as a sort of mindset and a sort of set of values. And in that mindset, we're emphasizing that communities are experts in their own experiences. Lawyers bring a certain type of legal expertise, but neither one is replacing the other. Right. And so our role is to help bring legal tools to problems communities may have already identified and not necessarily deciding what their problems are or what their problems should be or what the specific approach should be. And so I encourage folks always to think of community lawyering as a continuum, right? There's many different ways to engage in it. Again, there's I would say there are some wrong approaches to it, right? But there's many right ways to do it as well. There's many different kinds of ways to approach it, and it's more like a set of habits instead of a like separate practice area. And so a lot of those habits, right, include listening first, building mechanisms for shared decision making, respecting community expertise, being able to build and think about what long-term relationships look like, right? Instead of just transactional relationships or relationships that end once the litigation ends or once the issue is over. Right. It's also asking whether our legal strategy actually builds community power, right? And again, for a longer training, right, we would go into like, here's what power is, here's what the different types of power look like, right? But generally, right, the type of power that we're building in community lawyering relationships is power with, not power over, not power to decide for people, but power with people, right? Using our own power, using our own privilege as lawyers to enhance and advance the goals of the community. And so when you think of it as a continuum, right, there's different ways, many different kinds of practices and approaches. Some of that, again, it begins with listening and learning. This could look like building one-on-ones with the community members and organizers to build trust, helping to establish community advisory groups, right, where you can get direct feedback from community groups, right, on a policy campaign or on a litigation strategy. Relationship building, community-led or collaborative issue identification. This also looks like, again, sharing power, sharing strategy, right? Moving away from our traditional relationships where the lawyer is in charge of thinking about what's the legal strategy, right? So this looks like co-developing campaigns, testing legal theories with impacted people directly, incorporating organizer perspectives into strategy approaches. Participatory research is another form of building strategy with communities. Again, the power building piece is extremely important, right? In terms of not just holding power, right, and gatekeeping power, but giving people the education and the information that they need to be able to make the informed decisions and to be able to make decisions after you, again, exit the case or once you're no longer working on it as an attorney, right? Building up their capacity to be able to engage in that issue after you're gone. Supporting community infrastructure, right? Some pieces of that may be transactional. That may look like helping a community group to apply for 501(c)(3) status, helping a community group to figure out how to form a board of directors, right? So it may include those things that can build sustainable infrastructure for that community beyond, again, the litigation strategy or the legislative strategy. Developing community expertise in other ways. And then there's the litigation itself, right? And again, thinking about how we bring folks into litigation and that there can be complementary pieces to it, right? So thinking about, right, we may have a litigation strategy, but alongside of that or integrated with that, we may have a policy advocacy strategy where we're pursuing legislative advocacy alongside of that litigation that will ensure or reinforce the outcomes from the litigation, right? So how are we thinking about community, bringing them into that strategy as an example? And then again, building long-term partnerships is an important part of community lawyering practice or community advocacy practice, right? How we build durable relationships, how we support institutions beyond us, how we build their expertise, how we privilege them as experts, right? How other people can see them as experts when we're sharing that power, sharing that authority. And then, yeah, returning information to communities and creating tools and resources that they can use beyond your involvement. So again, this is just a reinforcement and some examples, right? So these are ways of looking and recognizing community expertise. Things like going to local institutions, right? Like often in legal services, we have intake models where people are coming to us, right? But in a community lawyering relationship or community advocacy relationship, you may be going out to the community. That may mean that you as a lawyer or as a paralegal or community advocate may be going to community meetings, maybe showing up at local institutions that are embedded in the community that you're working with. working with leaders in a community, right? Building out, again, sort of individual skills, capacities, and talents with particular people, serving in a sort of mentoring capacity. And then prior victories community has achieved, like being able to map those and uplift those and make that a part of the continuum. Because often, right, again, in traditional relationships, we may be coming in and then dropping in and ignoring some of the contextual history that needs to go along with thinking about strategy, thinking about our approach. The community holds that knowledge. They are the keepers of that knowledge. And so taking the time to work with community members to find out about that history and how and have it inform strategy and future approaches is really important. Here's some roles for us to avoid as lawyers and legal advocates working in community lawyering and movement contexts. And again, these are just typically, right, the approaches that we take. This is how we've been trained in some ways to work with communities, to be seen as the solution, to be the power broker, to be the expert in the room, to be the mouthpiece, to be the problem solver, right? And I am not here to say that there are not times when these roles aren't important or necessary or have some place, right? But when you're in community lawyering, right, it's not the default. It's not you are walking in a room with that expectation. And sometimes, right, it's a two-way street in terms of how communities see you, right? Because they have been also indoctrinated with these kinds of models, right? They rely on you to be the expert, the problem solver, et cetera, right? And so community lawyering requires us to take a step back from these more traditional roles, think about our place, think about whether it's strategic for us to be the power broker. Sometimes it is, right? Sometimes it remains strategic, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes you sort of make a way for communities to be able to step in and play that role, right? And it requires that subtle shift in power. It requires that relationship building, that long-term relationship connection, in order to shift those traditional roles. So these are just, again, roles to avoid, but not necessarily avoid, but to know the place of them, right? And to know when they are useful and when they're not, and to be conscious of these things that we often default to as our roles. I want to share a brief example before I pass it on to my co-presenters. So I am originally from Philadelphia. I'm now based in Los Angeles, and have been for the past 5 or 6 years, and now serve in my role as deputy director at Western Center. But prior to that, I was a longtime legal services attorney in Philadelphia. And one of the cases that came up for us was we were seeing, as in many communities, a wave of mass evictions happening in particular parts of the city. And in one particular area of the city, a building that had 200 and more residents in it, a property manager from New York came, bought the property, and then in one fell swoop terminated everybody in the building's lease agreement, after saying that they were not going to do that. And for some people in the building, they had lease agreements that extended 1 or 2 years into the future, right? So they were illegally terminating those leases. And then you had a number of people in the building who had Section 8 vouchers. And so for those people, they gave them less time to move, and then gave the other people an incentive to move sooner. And then after that, started filing eviction complaints in eviction court against everybody in the building. And so you have all these different things happening. I'm working in legal services where we have a team of about 5 attorneys, right? And because we're in legal services, not everybody in that building can qualify for our services, right? So there's only a subset of people in that building that we can represent. And so it requires a different approach, right? It required a lot of partnership. We worked with the Philadelphia Tenants Union to work with the tenants. And long story short, right, there were legal tactics that were involved in that, some more traditional legal tactics, right? So you have like 3 tiers of people. You have people who are being evicted illegally. You have people who are having things filed against them in court. And then you just have straight up discrimination happening. So we had to set up a tier of lawyers who could defend people in eviction court. but then also people who could deal with the immediate illegal evictions happening, lockouts, things of that nature, and then also deal with the discrimination part. Right. And so it required a very different approach. It required organizing some of the residents in the building who were dealing with immediate evictions, which meant bringing in people like the Philadelphia Tenants Union who could do blockades and who could take different approaches that the lawyers could not take, right? But working in lockstep with them around how we did that to make sure that we were coordinated. And then I ended up filing a bunch of discrimination cases for disability discrimination, race discrimination, age discrimination. And that also had an injunctive piece to it so that you could stop some of the evictions. But long story short, I couldn't represent everybody on those cases. And so it required a different approach where I worked with community members to be able to file their own cases, even though I couldn't represent them, and to work with the tenants union to do that as well. And then alongside of this, we also had a legislative campaign where the people in that building were campaigning and got their council person of that district to introduce legislation around good cause. And then also, meanwhile, right, we are empowering the residents and sorry, I hate that word empowering actually. We are supporting the residents to build their leadership. And so you have the people who came from, who are being evicted from this building, actively joining the tenants union and then taking on leadership roles in that tenants union so that they could also work on the legislative campaign alongside of it. So usually I would play this out over like a longer period of time, but since we only have a short amount of time, I can't go into all of the different nuances. But this is an example of taking a community lawyering approach versus just a very traditional sort of litigation heavy or transactional approach around doing these kinds of cases. And it turned into long-term wins. And so some of the outcomes from taking a community lawyering approach in that situation was that now impacted residents are leading the tenant unions. They're actively involved in other organizing movements that have translated into things like a right to counsel for tenants, tenant screening policies that protect tenants and that, stop landlords from being able to utilize eviction records in certain discriminatory ways. We also have seen that things like transactional work, helping residents to form nonprofits, things like that, have helped them to be able to preserve affordable housing properties. There's increased visibility and priority of housing issues through racial justice lens in the media and political platforms and policy development in Philly, and then et cetera. So just lots of different outcomes from taking that approach that might not come from, a less integrated, coordinated approach that does not privilege and prioritize the community lawyering techniques in its approach. So yeah, so just some opportunities and challenges, right? With taking these approaches, you can build relationships with community leaders. Again, there's sustainability of the work and increased visibility of efforts, increased likelihood of success and transformative change. And then, of course, there's challenges with taking these approaches, especially if there is a lack of organizational alignment to do this kind of work. Um, there can be challenges around building relationships, establishing trust, recognizing your privilege and power dynamics, relinquishing strategy or authority, and then working through conflicts and different goals, funding, time constraints, case priorities, team capacity, right? All of these are challenges. But they, I see a lot of balance and a lot of good that can come from taking that approach. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my co-presenter, Itisha. And just let me know when to change the slides.
Thank you. You can change the slide. I am Itisha, and I am a senior health advocate at Western Center. And so my primary focus has been on supporting our birth justice work and showing up in community spaces and bringing the needs of our community back to Western Center so that we can engage with community in a way that creates the results that Rashida was speaking about. So when we are thinking about community engagement, my background is in community organizing. I'm also a full spectrum doula. and the context in which I approach my work is from that lens. And so, in being at Western Center, um, I have really been thinking about how we really center the person. How do we center the community? Because they're the ones that have the experience, they're the ones that can provide context and expertise about the issues that we may find ourselves passionate about as advocates or passionate about as attorneys. And they live these experiences day to day. We also work with advocates. So folks outside of Western Center who have organizations or they lead community advisory groups. And so we work with those folks as well to understand how we can best support them in leading their communities and leading that change that they are advocating for, but really centering community as the decision makers. And so one of the ways that we do that is by collecting data. Data is information about people's lives. And we have to collect data as advocates, as attorneys, in order for us to be able to engage the expertise of the communities that we want to serve and be able to use that data well. And so before we even go into designing our methodology or our strategy, it's really important that we think about our privilege and where we're coming from, and our positionality as attorneys, advocates, um, what organization that we represent, what our own experiences have been. Um, and so being able to check that bias out the door before we even start the conversation with community and recognize how our perspective can shape the conversations that we have with community. Um, and the reason why it's important to do this and ask these really like introspective questions about who we are, what our privilege is, what our stance is because our lived experience also shapes our reality and how we assess the situation or decide on which information is important and which information is not, which groups are important to engage with and which groups are not. Um, and so a part of this is understanding disparities and root causes. So as we're thinking about supporting an issue, it's really important to understand what disparities show up in the population that we are trying to serve, how many of the issues that we are thinking about advocating for are multi-pronged. It's not a one size fits all solution. And so our approach can't be one size fits all either. Um, Also, when it comes to economic disparities, class disparities exist, especially within the context of this country. Um, those things also have to be addressed in our approach, even if we are not necessarily thinking that the issue is an economic issue. Oftentimes we do have to add that lens, and that's you may have heard the term intersectionality. We really have to approach community from this multi-pronged perspective when we are trying to work on an issue. Um, Also, historical context of policies, racism, discrimination, and other causes to those disparities is also really important, especially when we're engaging community. Um, I have worked on an environmental justice project in the past prior to being at Western Center. And when we were designing this project, it was in collaboration with community orgs. And those community orgs had said like that there needed to be some accountability in terms of how the city responded to complaints from the community about dumping, about toxic waste cleanup, about air quality in this particular neighborhood. And so, as we were thinking about how we can engage community, one of the things that we came up with was one, creating a mapping tool to be able to see where this toxic dumping or where these complaints were happening, and then being able to create responses to that in real time that the entire community can see. And then the part two to that was being able to hold monthly conversations in the community so that we can hear directly from community about how they're being impacted in their day-to-day lives by these environmental hazards or dumping or truck idling in their neighborhood, for example. And what came out of those conversations time and time again is that the community was tired of complaining. The community was tired of these issues being brought to the regulatory agencies or to elected officials, and there not being a solution for these complaints. And so a part of these conversations was really centered around trust building, and being able to have these representatives from regulatory agencies and elected officials present at every meeting. And so that took a while for us as an advocacy org to get the regulatory agencies and city departments to commit to being present at every meeting. But it happened. And once that happened, we started to see change. And we started to see trust blossom in these conversations and these dialogues. And we left room for there to be feelings, for there to be emotions. And a part of our role as advocates was to be able to provide balance to the conversation and to be able to help the city and these regulatory agencies respond in a way that the community was saying that they wanted a response. And from that, we were able to really see change in terms of how that neighborhood was being treated. And that's just one example. So it's really important that we bring historical context into the conversation, because this is a community that had been historically ignored, left out of conversation. This is a community that constantly was being asked to engage in some kind of research to understand the problem. But they were never shared what the solution was. And so when we approached them, they were tired of that. It was like a song and dance that they have already gone through before. And so when you're approaching community for engagement, it's really important to understand, how have other folks in the past engaged with this community? Because that's really important in terms of how the community is going to show up or how the community is going to trust you. And then when we think about also stereotypes or things that we might hold biases in, sometimes we don't realize that that's a bias. And so we may need to have a team that is diverse in experience, a team that understands maybe a bit more about where this community is coming from. And sometimes that can be from lived experience, sometimes that can be from work experience. But it's really important when you're designing the project team that you can kind of control for that by engaging a very diverse group of folks who are working on that project or that issue. And so it's important to note that implicit biases are pervasive. Everybody possesses them. They are related but not distinct from explicit biases. Our implicit biases tend to favor our own in-group, so who we grew up with, who we identify with, and they are malleable and can be surfaced and unlearned. And so with trainings like these, with conversations with folks that you don't normally have a conversation with, we can learn how to notice that bias and work on eliminating that bias, or work on being open to understanding new perspectives and new ways of knowing. Next slide, please. And so some methods that we have engaged with for connecting with community, learning more from community, I think these are the three primary methods that we've used so far in my work here at Western Center. These are not the only methods. I think Rashida did a great job at outlining some different approaches for engaging or connecting with community on an issue. Um, I think that when we see community, it's important to understand that community is rich in resources. Sometimes we describe communities as being under resourced or lacking, or that we have something that community needs. But I think it's an even better perspective to understand that communities are resource rich. And so when we understand that, then we can put ourselves in the perspective of or in the seat as a student, as a person who um, needs to learn something from this community who has so much to offer or so much to give. And so as we are approaching community, it's also important that it be balanced. And so not just thinking about what we can take or extract from community in terms of their data or their expertise, but also how can we give to community? How can we help to build infrastructure or to, um, work to support in solving, coming up with solutions for the issues that they are expressing to us that they're experiencing. Um, And so focus groups are a great way to connect with community. Um, Focus groups are sometimes helpful if you are engaging in a community that you have not necessarily had a relationship with in the past. Um, Maybe your team is not the best for like there's no one on your team that is a part of that group in which you're trying to engage with in terms of identity or experience. And so with focus groups, sometimes or most times people will hire a facilitator for that group conversation, and you can work on a discussion guide or questions to guide that conversation, and you can work on those questions either with community, or you can share those questions with like a community organization that is engaged in that community that you're wanting to be a part of your focus group. And so that allows there to be um, you know thinking through how you can get the most from this conversation, and also provide a sense of safety by making sure that that focus group is being facilitated by someone who looks like the community that you're trying to work with. For example, we didn't call it a focus group, we call it a listening session when we engage with the midwives and birth center owners and people who have had experience birthing at a birthing center here in California, because we wanted to understand some of the issues with birthing centers here in California, and some of the issues with midwifery access here in California. And so the focus groups were facilitated by midwives or people who work in the midwifery space. And so the people who attended those focus groups felt a sense of safety because they saw the person who was facilitating share their same experience or a similar experience to them. People also felt more comfortable with engaging in this conversation because the conversation was with people who have, again, shared similar experience working at a birthing center, as a midwife, or as someone who has delivered at a birthing center before. And so the way that focus groups are typically designed is that there is a seemingly natural flowing conversation that is had about a particular issue, and the conversation is guided or loosely guided by some of those discussion questions that I mentioned. Surveys are the most cost-effective way usually that folks will engage with community, but they don't have as in-depth of information. They're more quantitative. And so we've done surveys with doulas to understand some of the issues with access to their clients, and some of the issues with the payment model, and networking or being a part of the DHCS provider network. And because doulas are a new benefit in California, there was a lot of issues that are still ongoing, but we were able to learn some of those issues through surveying doulas. And so it gave us just enough to then be able to follow up on some of the issues in a more focused way. So surveys were good for that, like more surface level, quantitative type of data. But when we wanted to go in depth, then focus groups and interviews were better. And then for interviews, you may need to interview your client and have an actual one-on-one conversation with your client to be able to get the nuance of the issue, to be able to understand what's going on. If you're building a case, for example, those interviews are going to be rich in information or really illuminate a path for you to go down when it comes to specifically advocating for our community. Next slide, please. And so these are just some pros and cons of focus groups. When we talk about like them being easy to conduct, they're really efficient. Sometimes people will give gift cards. It depends on your organization for engaging or participating in the focus group. You may need to pay for a venue, or if you have the space in your own office, then you can hold it in your office. But sometimes people will want to have a focus group outside of the office to also create a sense of safety. Oftentimes, people will conduct a focus group in the neighborhood where the people are that they want to engage with. And then some cons is that the data may be difficult to analyze because it's more of a conversation. It may be harder to pull specific focus points from the conversations. And then assembling a group may require additional resources like doing phone calls or engaging with community orgs and having them do outreach to their communities. And we can go to the next slide. Surveys, I'll just briefly go over because we have one more person who needs to present. Surveys are good, but they're not able to deep dive, like I mentioned. You're not able to ask those follow-up questions or adapt to what the person is sharing. And there's limited context. And so because the questions are already set, a person's response, you're not able to necessarily understand why they responded the way that they did. And ability to not see the person asking the question can also sometimes make it so that the person responding is responding more authentically. And so anonymity is a benefit of a survey. Next slide. And then in-depth interviews is a great way to, again, get that qualitative data from a community. You're able to really go deep into the conversation. And yeah, I think we're going to share these slides. So I just want to make sure that I can like move to the last two slides because these are questions that you can reflect on about like checking your bias even before you begin the project. Like, how are you thinking about this work? What are your assumptions about the work and who your stakeholders are? Asking yourself what you don't know, knowing that you may not know what you don't know. And then how are you prepared to discuss disparities in their causes? Because there are so many layers when we're talking about community advocacy, and those layers are shaped by capitalism and racism and patriarchy. And it's important to understand that people are experiencing disparities because of systems, not because they're inherently bad people or that they didn't work hard or somehow that they're lacking. And so being able to approach the conversation with that lens is really important. And I think this is my last slide, the next one. Identify what action steps that you're going to take to participate or to practice this type of meaningful engagement. And so breaking it down into these these buckets to think about, like, how are you communicating? What's the point of your communication? How are you meeting people where they are? How are you mitigating power differences? How are you planning to facilitate in a way that's inclusive? And how are you allowing for steam to blow? Or how are you allowing for disagreement and not trying to control a community's emotions, but rather inviting your group, your team to lean in and really unpack, again, what is the historical context? What is the community experiencing that is causing like the emotions or the lack of trust to be there? But yeah, folks can ask questions in the chat. I will pass it over to Antoinette. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, and we will be sharing these slides after, so you'll have a chance to look through it.
Fantastic. So I am here to talk about a community lawyering experience with Black Parallel School Board, which was my client in the case, along with youth and their family against Sacramento Unified School District. I am Antoinette Dozier. I'm a senior attorney here at Western Center, and I work in Los Angeles. So Sacramento's a pretty ways away. Um, and the way that this case developed for us is that we work with a number of community groups in a variety of ways. And we had been doing some Know Your Rights trainings for parents on public assistance and hearing from them about the obstacles that they faced in getting training or work opportunities and maintaining those opportunities. And parents mentioned that, a number of them had children or youth who had mental health disabilities or other disabilities and weren't able to get either educationally related mental health services from their school district or other disability related services. So we did exactly what Atisha said. We did surveys. We did PRAs for data from a number of school districts and from the state. We sent out surveys to family and youth to learn more about the extent of the problem that they faced and asked them for the name of their communities. We did some mapping of that data and some data analysis with an expert. And then we wrote a white paper, a report on the issue, but we were looking to litigate the issue in order to force some reforms that we thought needed to happen in the system to make it much more likely that families would have access to these services. So we went looking and we identified Sacramento as an area that where we thought that there were issues, and began to investigate, look at the organizations that were working and already organizing parents and families of students with disabilities, Black students, other marginalized communities, and to hear from them. And we did exactly what Atisha mentioned. We started to talk to each of those organizations to hear from them about the work that they were doing, the problems that they were seeing. And we very quickly landed on Black Parallel School Board. It has been operating for nearly 2 decades in the Sacramento area. It's centered on developing and ensuring Black self-determination, already engaged in community-based advocacy and parent power. It was initially born out of a concern about the quality of education and education outcomes of Black students. And because many Black parents and the parents of Black youth felt that Sacramento school board meetings were disrespectful, not welcoming, that they would raise issues and they wouldn't get a follow-up or a response to their concerns. The organization is comprised already of parents, teachers, former principals, former union members, and community groups, right? So it is already a robust organization engaged in advocacy on the issue that we had identified. Fantastic. Um, and it is fantastic, but I think we needed to develop that community lawyering mindset to shift our focus from what we had plans to what the community organization and the community was already doing and develop a way to support those efforts. They had already done their own report about what was happening. They had supported another organization who did a pretty comprehensive report on the struggles of getting IEPs and disability related services for youth in the area. So they had their own report. They had done extensive advocacy already with the school board and didn't feel like they were getting the results that they wanted. And so they really we shifted to hear from them about what they wanted. And it turns out they did want litigation because they felt that their advocacy had not produced the results. And they wanted to have the advocacy focus on their goals and priorities. They're not a single issue organization or a single campaign organization. Their focus is on advocacy and achieving the broad goals of Black empowerment and Black self-determination and the outcome for youth in Sacramento. So we as lawyers started by really asking the question of what can we do to support you? And I think that was a shift in our mindset of both the legal team and in building that trust and that relationship with them to help support the efforts that they wanted to pursue. They started by asking for presentations, sort of know your rights presentations with respect to IEPs and school discipline. They wanted to take a look at the PRA results that we had and the data analysis. And they wanted to know, how could they get more information because that data sort of reflected their experience. They were able to identify holes in the data that we gathered the data is showing that, the disparate discipline rate is this percentage, but we think it's much higher from our intake and our own advocacy. And so we're really able to help shift our focus in developing the type of data request. So we interviewed parents who had used their advocacy. We did community presentations at their monthly meetings. One of our partners developed a legal intake line so that families who had utilized their advocacy efforts and who still were not feeling successful could contact the lawyers on our team who did handle individual cases. And out of that, we developed a case that was really guided by their experiences and the history of the issues there, filed a case in 2015, a class action. And the district immediately came to the table to engage in structured negotiations. I think you'll hear about structured negotiations sometime this summer if you continue with our litigation series. But it really allows the parties to come together to craft a settlement agreement that might not otherwise be crafted. Or get results that might not otherwise be achieved through litigation. As part of structured negotiation, there is some limited discovery and data sharing. And so we were really able to engage Black Parallel School Board in, what information should be gathered, where information might be located, what sort of information and issues might need to rise to the top. And out of that, we developed a settlement agreement and a 5-year term of implementation of of that settlement agreement and the terms of that agreement. Throughout the process, I think our focus and the mantra has continued to be, what can we do to support parents and families and this organization in their advocacy efforts? We don't want parents to be marginalized or tokenized throughout this process. So how can we ensure that parents are meaningfully at the table, that they're leading meetings, that they're not only participating and coming to meetings well prepared and able to engage in those meetings, but that they are the leading voices in those meetings so that the school board, which is the defendant, sees and hears directly from them on a consistent basis. We have, as part of the settlement agreement, and something that they requested, was that the district regularly hold town hall meetings where they present on the the goals of the settlement agreement, the progress of implementation, and take community both input and questions. The Black Parallel School Board is intricately involved in developing those presentations. They give feedback, making sure that the language that's used by the school district during those town halls is something that's accessible and understandable to parents, that the meeting and town hall dates and times are dates and times that families can attend, right? That it's not a date and time where families are working or engaged in childcare responsibilities and so are unable to attend. They themselves, Black Parallel School Board holds monthly meetings where they invite continued engagement. We've continued with now a monthly legal clinic where we not only train parent advocates from Black Parallel School Board to support families, but then for those cases that are more complex or that have reached an impasse, they have the benefit of actually consulting with attorneys who take their cases and help address those issues in IEPs and school discipline. And so there's this partnership that's been developed that, yes, we are engaged in litigation and in the lawyering that has to occur as monitors of a settlement agreement and ensuring that that settlement agreement is implemented. But at the same time, we've continued to support the efforts and the ongoing advocacy efforts of this community group. Um, they have continued to provide invaluable information about the stakeholders and the players involved in the district. They've had a long history of advocacy, and so they can sometimes have conversations with stakeholders that we as lawyers who don't have the same relationship with those stakeholders can't have. They sometimes are able to identify people and sources of information that we would not otherwise know about by virtue of lawyering in that area because, like I said, they are principals or former principals, teachers, community members. And so they have the depth of relationship, the knowledge, the history of that school district and that area to pinpoint key people and key sources that we probably wouldn't you couldn't get from an interrogatory or through discovery. And so I think when you're looking to litigate, and litigation is an interest, and you believe in litigation as an advocacy tool, um, I do think it's beneficial to adopt the community lawyering mindset and approach as a means to do that, because what you'll recognize is that you'll have a partner that will advance justice, ensure that justice is longstanding and preserving, but that also that you're doing it in a way that supports the efforts of folks who are already working very hard in their community to enact change. So maybe a minute for a question.
So we did have one question, well, we had two questions. One was about how we structure legal services agreements, common interest agreements, and conflict waivers. So I don't know if you've had experience with that, Antoinette, that you want to share. And I said if I can find an example, I'll share it out with the materials. And then someone else also asked, do you have any stories of how community lawyering goals conflicted with grant requirements or executive leadership and how you navigated that?
So as to the first, we do have a standard retainer agreements, but I think when you're talking about community organizations and other clients who are going to especially be part of litigation, you owe duties, equal duties to all of your clients. And so it really behooves you to talk to all of the clients and all the potential plaintiffs or the folks that you're representing about your ethical obligation to all of them to have terms about how you're going to resolve disagreements amongst the clients should they occur, how you're going to resolve disagreements between yourself and your clients should they occur. And so sometimes when you're working with community organizations, they have their own stakeholders, members that they answer to and that are comprised. They may have other organizations and groups that they regularly work with or relationships they have to navigate. And so what I found is that that's where you sometimes see the conflict may arise that's not addressed by those retainer agreements or those other common interest agreements is sort of these outside forces that because your community group is a community-based group, there's lots of folks operating in the community and they're navigating lots of relationships. Sometimes there's conflicts that arise there that are unanticipated that you do have to navigate. And of course, keeping your ethical obligations in mind and kind of referring back to the goals and really listening to the community organization and being very real with them about what you can and can't do and your ethical obligations and having them take it back and think through and then having them sort of propose solutions often is the best way to navigate it instead of trying to impose a solution when those conflicts arise because they know the people, they know the players, they are often great at strategic thinking and so um, are some of your best partners in sort of trying to resolve conflicts.
Excellent. And Tisha, I don't know if you wanted to add anything before we wrap
Um,
up.
no, I just wanted to say that when it comes to um, your goals being like in conflict with grant deliverables or with executive leadership, sometimes you have to find ways to argue that your goals are actually in alignment. An example of that is I wanted to create focus groups and get a budget to create focus groups when I was working at San Francisco Health Plan. And the purpose of the focus groups was to understand the unique needs of our Black members, our Chinese speaking members, and our Spanish speaking members. And I had to find ways to be able to say that we should be measuring for this based on what our contract said with the Department of Healthcare Services and the Department of Managed Healthcare. And so I had to like find how to say like, hey, we it's actually better for us to do it this way based on what these agencies are saying that they want to see from us in our reporting. So you may need to find how there's alignment, or when we do go for grants, we go for grants with that goal in mind of like we are trying to understand more about this community and we're engaging with community in this way. And so when we apply for grants, we build that language in the grants that we're applying for at Western Center. And so maybe it requires you being a part of those conversations with your funding, your development team about how you can apply for grants in a way that really is about the goals that you have as a project team or as the folks who are doing the work on the ground. For Western Center, we are in conversation with our development team. It's not that the development team is handing us a project that they came up with. It's a conversation that we have, and so we collaborate on grant proposals and things like that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of my co-presenters for your amazing work and brilliant advice. This sounds to me like it bears a part two. So if folks are interested, we could try to set that up because community lawyering, of course, it's so nuanced. There's a lot of different aspects to it that we can talk about. If for some of you who may know this already, there used to be a community lawyering course that Shriver Center on Poverty Law used to do. Um, so there's lots that we could talk about around this, and so we'll see about setting up a part two. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your attendance. We have four more, I think, sessions to go in our summer training series. So please go to our website and sign up, and you can also see the recordings from the past ones. Thank you. Have a great long weekend.
Thank you.